The Verge, well known for PC build guides. They recently put out an article that has been making the rounds in the Linux space. I went back to Linux, and it was a mistake. I need an OS, not another hobby. And considering all of the positive coverage Linux has been getting lately, you know what? I think we need some criticism. I think we need some dissent. We need some anger. Everything's getting too positive. This was written by Terrence O'Brien, and this is very important because, as you will see, the author is not new to Linux. In fact, is very not new to Linux. They're a returning Linux user. It's a complete coincidence that I installed Linux around the same time as my colleagues Nathan Edwards and Stevie Bonifield. A few months ago, I decided to breathe new life into a 2019 Dell XPS 15 that had been collecting dust for a couple of years. This is a totally reasonable, totally sensible device. Even if this wasn't like a high-end spec device when it came out, this was a Coffee Lake refresh device, even like a low-end 2019 laptop is totally reasonable. I've seen these YouTube videos that come out where it's like, I installed Linux on a 5-year-old laptop. Is it actually good? Yeah, a 5-year-old laptop is totally fine. A 10-year-old laptop is totally fine. Anything released in the past decade that's not like a Pentium or like a Celeron, still a totally working device. Now on Windows, well, Windows is going to get frustratingly slow on it. The fan was constantly at full throttle even when the machine was idle. That's because it wasn't idle, it was constantly running processes in the background, stealing all of your data, and it regularly failed to install updates. Windows. So back in 2024, he temporarily went to an M1 MacBook Pro. This is when Apple devices started to get really good. Now, repairability, well, whole nother question. But the Apple Silicon is really powerful. Before the MacBook and before the Dell XPS, I was a Linux user. I first installed Ubuntu in 2006 on a ThinkPad X40, and it remained my primary OS across 3 different laptops and 13 years. This is certainly a desktop. It's not my vibe, but it's certainly a desktop. Now, Ubuntu is going to be very relevant, and you can probably already begin to guess why. I was happy with Linux for a long time. I dual booted Windows out of necessity and often had a work-issued MacBook on hand, but those were for testing apps or specific tasks like editing video. 99% of my life was spent in Ubuntu. That is until about 2017. As I got older, tinkering with my laptop changed from a hobby to something that got in the way of me pursuing my other hobbies. I had rediscovered my love of making music, and try as it might, Ubuntu Studio just wasn't cutting it. You didn't need to change distro at the time to do, like, audio stuff. Anyway, moving on from that, I was spending more time in Ableton Live, which meant more time in Windows, until in 2019 I bought the aforementioned XPS and switched over completely. So his primary reason for originally leaving Linux was he needed to use Windows software. Yes, the whole tinkering stuff, all this stuff obviously gets in the way, but if you're spending a lot of time working on Windows software that only runs on Windows, you know, that's gonna be your primary reason. And it's gonna be the case for anyone, right? If you primarily work in, like, Photoshop, for example, even if you really like Linux, if you have a job that requires you to use that, and then you do things out of your job that uses that, maybe it's just like a hobby that you spend a lot of time on, you're not going to spend as much time using Linux. A lot has changed in the 20 years since I first installed Linux, and even in the 7 years since I last used it. It is now arguably the best platform for PC gaming. As long as you don't play competitive games, it's definitely getting there. I think it's a little bit premature to say it is the best, but the gap is a lot smaller than even where it was like 2 or 3 years ago. There are genuinely great photo editing apps such as Darktable, which came out back in 2009, and there are even viable commercial options for making music in Bitwig and Reaper. If you do game development, you also have that as well, and so many other spaces. There actually are viable options on Linux. video recording, 3D modeling. Both of these are basically run by a major open source application. So this takes us into his latest endeavor, using Linux. And I mentioned it before, and from the start he made his very first mistake. He chose to install Ubuntu. Now, I know people who are not Linux people are going to be like, oh, well, any distro you pick is going to be the wrong choice. No. Ubuntu is the wrong choice. I really wish we could stop encouraging new or returning Linux users to go and use Ubuntu. Frankly, go and use most things Debian-based. I give a bit of leeway to Mint, just because Mint is so conservative in their changes, but especially Ubuntu. There are so many better options. Most things are a better option. How? I know, like, if you're an old school Linux user, right, you first used Linux in 2006, oh wow, Ubuntu, so great. Just don't. just don't. There are so many problems you can avoid by not doing Ubuntu. But, of course, the installation process is basically the same. It's click next and you're good to go. But I chickened out at the last minute and decided to dual boot, which meant repartitioning my hard drive. This is another thing which I really wish we didn't encourage people to do. Yes, you can dual boot, but you're going to create more problems for yourself, especially when you're repartitioning the drive, especially if you don't know what you're doing with that. Luckily, in his case, he was fine with that. My suggestion is, if you can, clean drive. Clean drive, preferably clean system that only has Linux on it. Understandably, that is not as easy to do, but clean drive is my biggest recommendation, and keep the Linux stuff on the Linux drive. Or on multiple drives if you have multiple drives. Right off the bat, I was reminded that Linux hasn't completely overcome its fiddly nature. The fingerprint reader didn't work, a minor annoyance I decided to ignore. I did a very quick search for this specific device, the XPS 15 2019, and the fingerprint reader, and I came across this. So, this is a different XPS device, but it's still an XPS device. Very likely has the same fingerprint reader. It's missing a package. Yeah. Especially for a really popular device like this, you can usually find answers really, really quickly. More concerning was that Ubuntu failed to install updates because of an EFI partition issue specific to the XPS 15 that was also causing problems under Windows. This is not a problem specific to the XPS 15. That doesn't even make sense why it would be a problem to it, unless they ship it configured badly out of the box. This is a problem with having an EFI partition that's way too small. For some reason, I don't understand why, there are distros that give you a 500 megabyte EFI partition. Why they do that? I don't know. It's not 1999 anymore. There is no reason to do that. This is why Pop! OS and any other sensible distro is going to give you a gigabyte. This is not a problem that would have occurred if he wasn't dual booting. It's also a problem that wouldn't have occurred if he didn't use Ubuntu. For instance, here we have the Arch Linux install guide. Suggested size, 1 gigabyte. Why there would even be distros that don't do that at this point, I honestly couldn't tell you. An extra 500 megabytes is not really that important, especially for all of the problems that it's going to solve. Now, you can also solve it by going and changing the compression, but that shouldn't be a problem that you have to solve. They should just do it properly and stop having an EFI partition that is that small. Ubuntu also refused to mount a Windows partition for the first month or so before suddenly working for unknown reasons. Again, this is another problem caused by dual booting. NTFS is very wonky under Linux. There's a couple of ways to do it. None of them are good. The best way to do it is to not do it and not try to mount an NTFS drive under Linux. This is just what's going to happen if you're dealing with NTFS. The other way is considerably better, doing ext4 under Windows, and that's mainly because of WSL. So if they want to have, Linux working properly, they kind of need ext4 and other Linux file systems to work properly. But best solution, don't try to bring your Windows drive over. If you want to have the data brought over, bring the data over. I really am not a dual boot supporter. I am not a dual boot fan. If you want to dual boot, have two distinct systems. Do not try to mix and match things. You are going to cause yourself problems. Stevie similarly admitted to rage quitting and going to bed when they couldn't get Ubuntu to connect to a second SSD. Now, the thing I like about this post is there's a couple of times in here where the author quote mines another one of the authors at The Verge, and then links to the article, but what they said happened didn't happen. Here's that piece. I spent a year on Linux and forget to miss Windows. So, I couldn't figure out how to get a second SSD connected properly that first night and ended up rage quitting and going to bed, thinking I'd probably have to reinstall Windows the next day. So this is that quote that was included in the main piece. But in the morning, I logged back into Ubuntu and realized what was wrong with my SSD. I hadn't created an entry for the drive in my file system table or FS tab, which is where you configure how disks and storage devices are mounted to your PC's file system. After fixing it, I started to think that maybe this whole Linux thing isn't so bad after all. The reason why he rage quit is because he tried to brute force learning how to mount a drive and didn't look up how to mount a drive. Then when he did, he realized, oh, I mount a drive with the mount command and then put the thing in the FS tab file and everything is fine. So this idea that he rage quitted because he couldn't work it out. Yeah, he rage quitted because he couldn't work it out because he didn't go and read either the documentation or literally just looking up how to mount a drive on Linux. Yeah, if you don't try to learn how to do things, you won't learn how to do things. What a fun bit of quote mining to make it seem like a widespread issue. On that note, Nathan had his own bizarre problems where his CashOS refused to acknowledge his mouse clicks. Again. Interesting quote mining we have here. I replaced Windows with Linux and everything's going great. The mouse in question is an ancient Mad Cat Cyborg Rat 7. Turns out this is a known issue. Now you might say, how does a mouse not work on Linux? Like, if I plug in a mouse, it works. Any mouse I plug in is going to work. And that's true for basically everything made. Actually, I'm going to go out on a limb and say every mouse made in at least the last decade. This is a 16-year-old mouse made by a gaming peripheral company. And do not question how stupid a gaming peripheral company can be with how they make a device. The known issue is documented on the Arch Wiki, because so many things are on the Arch Wiki. This is before the time it was common to have onboard memory on the mouse. So you'd run whatever stupid software the mouse needed in the background, it would configure the mouse. If you close the software, the mouse would break. That happened on Windows as well. So if you're going to run the mouse on Linux, you need something to fill in those gaps. And that was going to be Xorg. Xorg was going to have to fill in those gaps. If you didn't go and configure it properly, it basically didn't work. And there's a whole list of things that just do not function with this mouse. I have never heard of another mouse that has this problem. I have never owned a mouse that has this problem. I've never spoken to anyone that has a mouse with this problem. Just don't use 16-year-old weird gaming peripherals and it's gonna be fine. I know, that's like a giant hurdle to like jump over. Even like like normal gaming peripherals, right? I have a Logitech G600. I have another Logitech mouse over here. I have a Logitech keyboard. If you have a Razer mouse, you have a Corsair mouse, all of these things are going to work fine, and there's configuration software for them. No one cares about like a 15, 16-year-old Mad Cat's mouse. Honestly, this is a mouse that probably has issues at this point running on Windows, because I doubt it's still properly supported by whatever Mad Cat software happens to be out there. He was also hit with option paralysis, choosing between 14 bootloaders and 13 Distro environments. Now, I understand having option paralysis when you're looking at, I don't know, ice cream flavors. You know what vanilla and strawberry and chocolate and Oreo, whatever flavors there happen to be. If you don't know what you're looking at, there's a very simple solution to this problem. You click the first one. Problem solved. For some, this is part of the appeal. The infinite customizability, the power to bend your computer to your every whim to make it truly yours. Ubuntu doesn't throw its customizability in your face the way Kashii does, but it's still there if you want it. Well, the reason why it doesn't do that is because you're probably running GNOME, and GNOME, well, yeah. Also, Ubuntu does have the level of customizability that Kashii does when it comes to installing your desktop. They just don't have it in the installer. They just have a bunch of different flavors. There's Ubuntu, there's Kubuntu, there's Ubuntu, there's all of these things. It's the same functionally as Kashii OS. It's just at a different stage of obtaining the distro. Fedora Linux is a great example, actually. If we go to the spins, like, you got all of these things here. You got these atomic desktops, you got these editions, you got these labs. All of these things are basically selections like you would have in Kashii OS. They're just not at the installation level. Also, a lot of people talk about, you know, the customizability of Linux, and especially like KDE, right? I'm gonna tell you something crazy. You don't actually have to customize Plasma. You actually can just install it and just use it default like you would use GNOME. I know, right? Like, having toggles there, you don't actually have to turn the knob. I will say, though, if you have no self-control, if you see a knob and you have to turn it, I understand why something like Ubuntu with GNOME is more streamlined, because you just see Ubuntu, you don't even acknowledge the fact that other flavors exist, you install GNOME, and then there's nothing to configure, so it's not scary. You don't have to even think about not configuring anything, because there's nothing to configure. Until you realize a few minutes in where you're like, I actually need some extensions. It's really fun when people talk about, like, not having to configure GNOME, and then mention having, like, 10 different extensions installed. There's just something amusing to me about that. The problem, as I encountered during my days of meticulously tweaking desktops and crafting my dream note-taking app using Obsidian, is you're building a house of cards. One tiny thing in some seemingly inconsequential library or plugin could cause the whole system to come crumbling. I've never heard anyone have this issue with Obsidian. Like, at all. I'm not really sure what issue you're seeing here with Obsidian that's not a problem of, like, self-infliction, right? I can see how you can break it yourself by having a bad note-taking system, but I don't really understand, like how this has anything really to do with Linux. I don't want to be wasting my time tweaking and troubleshooting when I already have things that work, he says as an Obsidian user. Even if you keep it simple, as I did on my XPS, you're hardly guaranteed smooth sailing. Ubuntu is one of the best supported Linux distros. I've already addressed this, we're moving on from that. And while my specific XPS 15 isn't one of them, Dell has sold many Ubuntu certified laptops over the years, so I figured I was in the clear. I was wrong. Well, they didn't certify this specific device, so it's a different device, but also it's a very popular device, and as I showed before, the issue that you had, that's a well-solvable problem. It's not even one of those problems where you had to, like, dig deep into the labyrinths of forums, anything like that. It was the first result on any search engine. Several apps, whether from the official Ubuntu App Center, downloaded snaps, or deb packages, quietly failed to install. No obvious error, nothing. I had to open the terminal and install them from there to see what went wrong. Installing software on Linux is somehow even more confusing than it was 20 years ago. I actually will grant him this, because I do not like this insistence that you have to do everything with a graphical software center. Now, the graphical software centers could be good. The problem is oftentimes they do a really bad job at explaining when a problem goes wrong. So if you're not used to using the terminal, you see an error, maybe you don't even see an error, maybe it just quietly fails, and then you don't know what to do about it. I think if you're a new Linux user, you shouldn't be using these graphical software centers outside of things like snaps, don't even install them, and flatpaks. For your, like, anything else, any, like, regular packages, you should be doing it from the terminal just so you can learn what to do when something goes wrong. And this isn't just a GNOME Software Center problem. This happens with every graphical software center. I don't think these should be pushed to regular users, like, as much as they are. I know that, like, doing things with a GUI is easier and all this, but I think it sets people up for failure when something inevitably goes wrong. Even the things that worked weren't seamless. I got Steam up and running, but it took hours, required installing outdated 32-bit libraries, and it crashed along the way. These were not outdated 32-bit libraries. They were up-to-date 32-bit libraries that Steam still requires, because Steam on Linux is still 32-bit, like it was on Windows up until about 2 months ago. It's just, it does all of that stuff for you with the wizard. Also, yeah, Steam does crash sometimes. I will give you that one. The Steam client does sometimes crash. Oh, and Steam games refuse to recognize my audio interface. They would only play through the laptop speakers. Did you have it set as your default audio device? Because I've made that mistake before. CacheOS or Bazzite would have provided a smoother Steam experience, but it's also illustrative of the problem. Saying you use Linux is almost meaningless because there are so many different flavors. If you knew that you could have used those instead and it would have been better, why did you install Ubuntu? Most of these problems are Ubuntu problems. Thankfully, Bitwig recognized my audio interface, which implies to me that, yeah, he probably didn't have it set as his default device, but an audio software that can control which device it's selecting was able to find it. But it was fickle about MIDI controllers it wanted to work with, an issue I'd never had on the Mac version. And it crashed the first time I tried to run it. Also, while the native Bitwig instruments are solid, I miss my favorite synths and effects like Artorias Pigment, which is Windows and Mac only. This is a problem that exists just with audio production stuff, and yet this is a valid problem. I don't know about these ones, but you can get a lot of audio plugins actually working. It just requires going and getting it working. This is a problem basically caused by the fact that Linux just hasn't really been used much by audio professionals. We have a lot of great programming tools because there's a lot of programmers on Linux. We have good design tools because there's a lot of designers on Linux. 3D modeling, game development tools, all this stuff. Audio production, not so much, so you're kind of in this like chicken and egg problem. You need audio producers to use Linux to get better audio software, but then you need better audio software for production audio to be on Linux. See the issue here? There were a handful of other annoyances. If my laptop went to sleep, which it seems to only do when it's plugged in, go figure, it refused to reconnect to the external hard drive I have hooked up, and it stopped recognizing the SD card reader. Now, I have to open the lid to wake it when it's hooked up to my dock and an external monitor. That dock is a Thunderbolt dock. It's always Thunderbolt! Man, it's a repeat of the stupid LTT problems once again. Stop using Thunderbolt. I wish Thunderbolt worked well on Linux. That would be great. It doesn't. So can we just acknowledge that Thunderbolt is awful and stop, please? It also doesn't wake on input from a Bluetooth mouse or keyboard. This one I'm not sure about, but again, Bluetooth, so Probably something Bluetooth. That actually probably is a problem. It also may just be a setting that I'm unaware of. I don't sleep my device, so yeah, that's not an issue that I have. Also, why do you have a... Sorry. Why do you have a Bluetooth keyboard plugged into a laptop? Like, I understand a Bluetooth mouse, but why do you have a Bluetooth keyboard plugged into a laptop? I guess not plugged in because it's Bluetooth, but you know what I'm saying. Why? Why have you done this? If I just need a web browser, Ubuntu works like a charm. Yeah, and that's basically the only reason I would use Ubuntu. I had no issues with my Wi-Fi or with Firefox. My XPS now runs faster and quieter than it did with Windows, and I got Obsidian up and running with minimal fuss. I used Ubuntu as my primary work machine for a few days, and everything was fine. But I can do most of my job from the confines of a web browser. It's everything else. I can game on my Linux machine, but the experience is smoother on my Switch or PS4. I can make music in Bitwig or Reaper on Ubuntu, but Ableton on macOS is easier to use and supports all my VSTs. GIMP and Darktable offer solid image editing, but let's be honest, they're nowhere near as powerful as Lightroom and Photoshop. Linux can do the things now, sometimes better than Windows, but for all it does, it always feels like there's a better option. It honestly feels like to me, this author went into this kinda hoping for things to fail. Went into this knowing that they relied on Windows software, knowing that they were never gonna have a good experience, rather than trying to actually use Linux and experience what Linux can do. Because you're gonna have a learning curve. This is gonna be the case no matter what operating system you go to. If you go to macOS, you're gonna have to learn new things, you're gonna have to use new software. But for some reason, a lot of people treat Linux as this thing where you shouldn't have to learn it. It should just magically, by osmosis, make its way into your mind. And that's just not how computers work. The reason why Windows feels comfortable is you've used it for a long time. The reason why macOS feels comfortable is you've used it for a long time. And when you've used Linux for a couple of years, you're gonna have that same feeling. This was certainly an interesting piece. And I understand the I need an OS, not another hobby. But there were like 4 problems he identified, all of which are very solvable problems, and then you'd be about your day and you wouldn't have any more problems, right? So I'll leave the piece linked down below. If you want to go read it for yourself, go and do so. I love The Verge, man. The Verge is such like a weird outlet. Because, like, there are these other pieces that are praising Linux that then he quote mine as, like, hating Linux. But then there's just this. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down below. If you liked the video, go like the video. Do all that cool stuff. Go subscribe as well. Say let you know your thoughts. Yeah, do that. Yeah. So, that's going to be it for me. Go subscribe. Yeah. If you want to become one of these people over here, check out the Patreon. Subscribe to Daily Bear Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and at least it's not the PC build guide.
Something like this.